I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome back to the Sky News Daily, where, look, unless you've been living in a bunker with no access to Wi-Fi, you will have realised that today was the day that Boris Johnson appeared in front of the COVID inquiry. The man who, of course, is ultimately responsible for all of the decisions that the government took during that period. In a second, we'll be speaking to our political editor, Beth Rigby. But of course, the presence of Boris Johnson at the inquiry today was always going to provoke a reaction from the families of those who lost their lives to COVID. Many were outside, many of them were in the room. Indeed, some of them interrupted the former Prime Minister as he was once again apologising, saying sorry for the suffering that many, many people have endured. Before we speak to Beth, let's just have a quick listen to Mr Johnson.
Can I just say how glad I am to be at this inquiry, and how sorry I am for the pain and the loss and the suffering
sit down.
Of
please stop.
COVID
Johnson.
victims.
Please sit down. Please sit down, or I'm afraid you'll have to leave the hearing room. I'm sorry, if you don't sit down, I'm going to ask the ushers to get you to leave. Right, ushers, please, could you ask them to leave?
Could I say, by your leave, that I understand the feelings of these victims and their families, and I am deeply sorry for the pain and the loss and the suffering of those victims and their families. And grateful though I am to the hundreds of thousands of healthcare workers and many other public servants and people in all walks of life who help to protect our country.
And as mentioned, our political editor, Beth Rigby, is back with us in the studio. We have so much to discuss, Beth, and I suppose we should say it first, because, of course, timings and all the rest of it, we are recording this whilst Mr Johnson is still being interrogated by Hugo Keith, the counsel for the inquiry. So there may well be more information to come. But look, this was divided up into three sections today. And let's start with the first, which was, I think in my mind, was how the decisions were being made in government, who Boris Johnson was speaking to, who he was relying upon, and indeed just a little bit of their competing assessments of how everyone was doing. What did you make of it? Because I heard from Boris Johnson, as well as him saying a number of times, I don't remember. He was pretty clear that when it came to what was going on, his information, he was relying on two people, the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor.
And the Health Secretary. Look, Neil, I think we've heard so much about Boris Johnson through this COVID inquiry, haven't we? About how he led Downing Street, about how he prevaricated, about him being the trolley, etc., etc. And I think what he's trying to do in this sort of early sections is to establish this. Number one, he is trying to not make any personal attacks, and he's trying to just step away from getting into any tittle-tattle. At the same time, basically refuting any criticisms of how he led government. And he does that in a way of saying everyone was trying their best. When people are feeling anxiety under acute pressure, they tend to blame others. So he almost dismisses criticisms of him as a feature of the pandemic, not of his leadership style, which is pretty much not what anyone else around him has said. I think that's the first point to make. And then the second point, Neil, really is, as you say, he, on the one hand, says mistakes were made. On the second, in the next point, he says, I accept responsibility, and then proceeds in all of his evidence to say, well, I was relying on information from other people. And if mistakes were made, it's effectively a collective endeavour of mistakes. So even though he is the top honcho, he's not really carrying the can. And what's interesting about that is in other organisations, if something goes massively wrong in a business, whether it was the CEO's fault or not is a moot point. The CEO carries the can.
Absolutely.
And what he's not doing here really is carrying the can or in any way putting the blame onto himself for mistakes that were made. While acknowledging they were, he turns it back to a government machine, and he doesn't pick out individuals, Neil. He doesn't say the CMO did this or the CSA did this.
I thought a really fascinating point today where clearly a lot of what the Council for the Inquiry was trying to do was establish that there was something of a toxic culture going on inside Downing Street at that point, that they could not recruit the people that they wanted to into the government machinery because of, let's name him, Dominic Cummings and the culture that he had inculcated.
The only admission he did around kind of conduct in Number 10 was where he said, I didn't have a good enough gender balance in my team. And in retrospect, that was a mistake. But Neil, what you hit upon with the kind of what Boris Johnson said to what the evidence showed is what's been seen repeatedly in this inquiry. And, you know, we've both sat there all morning listening to the testimony, and then Boris Johnson has said something and then he's directly contradicted by evidence. So one example being he talks a lot about how the government, Number 10, were not made aware of the potential seriousness of the pandemic, of the possibility of a pandemic in January when it's spreading through Wuhan. And then the KC pulls up two pieces of evidence. One, a Cobra meeting on Jan the 29th, where the chief medical officer raises a scenario where the outbreak could turn into a pandemic and the UK could be impacted. And then a message that the Prime Minister gets into his box notes. That's basically his big red box of stuff that civil servants stick in every night that he's got to read, saying that the Foreign Office are pulling British nationals out of Wuhan. And the KC says at this point, that there is evidence building up.
But his argument was that it didn't reach the political side of things.
But
I think he even said at one point, I wasn't being asked about it at PMQs, therefore, how could I have known about it?
For me today, we know quite a lot of this already, because we've had loads of evidence. But the thing that really struck me was, if you are someone watching this and you've lost a loved one and you are feeling deeply aggrieved, this is not going to make you feel in any way. It's going to just anger you more.
Doesn't this all go to the dysfunction at the heart of government, the lack of relationships between key people?
Yeah, and for me, Neil, what it does is it reflects what we have learnt during this COVID inquiry, the culture within Number 10 and the culture set by a Prime Minister, whereby there doesn't seem to be process and systems in place where this is systematically dealt with, which someone like Dominic Cummings, I would imagine, would say, well, that's the kind of nature of chaotic trolley-style government, which he would argue that Boris Johnson led. Now, Boris Johnson, of course, is saying that's not the case. But you have to look at it and you think, why wasn't the Prime Minister chairing Cobra meetings in January?
Because there were five of them. There were five of them. And he admitted that he knew that they were taking place. And he just said, I told Matt to update me as necessary.
Matt to update me. And then when he's asked about whether or not information was passed to him, he says things like, I don't remember. On the other hand, I do have some sympathy with him in that when he's talking about what they were dealing with, it is true as well that in February into March, it was the scientists were not clear about the strategy. They weren't, they were kind of thinking they could try herd immunity. Then they began to realise that the infection levels were such and the transmission was such that the virus was going to overwhelm the NHS. And I remember that weekend, like the March the 13th, the weekend in which they all went, well, as Helen McNamara, didn't she walk into the cabinet room and the documentation, she said, F, swear word. We're F, we don't have a plan. And, and he talked a lot today about kind of the realisation, the penny dropping that probably lockdowns are inevitable. But then the kind of torturous route to get there as well, right?
But wasn't that what Hugo Keith, the Inquiry Counsel, wasn't that what he was trying to do in the second section today? That he was showing, Boris Johnson was saying this information wasn't being presented to me directly. I mean, it's in that second section, a couple of bits leapt out to me. For example, that we now know that by January the 16th, the government was aware that COVID had spread to Thailand and Japan. They were aware that there was a 12% hospitalisation rate. They were aware that in Wuhan in China there was under-reporting of the number of cases and that there was person-to-person transmission. At that stage, Hugo Keith was perhaps alluding to, we should have geared up and got on, but we didn't. we knew about asymptomatic transmission by the middle of February. In fact, the Chief Medical Officer mentioned it at the end of January.
But what's interesting in the evidence is Keith is giving all of these pieces of evidence, and the testimony is like, yeah, but I didn't hear that, or no, I didn't quite get that, or it wasn't really explained to me in that way. My takeaway from all of it actually is that there needs to be a different system. There needs to be a different alerting system, right? Because what happened in this case was there were warning flags all over the place, but it's kind of like they weren't being waved in a way that built up a pattern that triggered a set of consequences,
but did it even need to be that nuanced? It struck me at times during that second section that actually what we were seeing was evidence that you're standing on a set of train tracks, there's a train coming towards you, and no one is just shouting, "Train, look out for the train."
But I also think that when I was listening to it, because I've covered a few PMs, I thought, I wonder how Theresa May's government would have dealt with this, or maybe even Rishi Sunak's, in the sense of it is partly about the leader at the top and their attention to detail and how methodical they might be. And Johnson is not known as an attention to detail, methodical leader. That's never been his calling card, right? We all know that. You look back, really, it seems to me that the kind of most revelatory stuff in this session has been all about January into February.
Absolutely.
And a Prime Minister who had just won an election, had worked insanely hard, had been on campaign mode really since he took over as leader in July 2019. And, he was probably wanting to enjoy the spoils of his victory. He probably wanted a bit of a rest, yeah? And so in January, it's like, well, I'll leave it to Matt. And it was interesting. The only moment I thought he got a little bit testy, did you notice this?
Yeah, when it was
were you on holiday in February?
Yeah.
And he got a bit tetchy. And that was the only time God knows what's happened in this past half an hour nearly.
I know.
Completely bonkers.
But you're taking us into February. I mean, let's look at the Cobra meeting of the 29th of January and the box note that went in the following day. At that Cobra meeting, which he did not chair, it was still Matt Hancock, of course, there were two options as to what was going to happen with COVID.
Yeah.
One, China would contain it, or two, there would be a pandemic. Yeah. It's there in black and white. Yeah. And on the basis of that, it was mid-March.
So
mid-March when we finally got to speed with this.
You might then think at that point, right, okay, well, we need to really work on Plan B. But his argument was like, yes, but we've had these viruses before, and they haven't turned into a global pandemic. And
they didn't have evidence of a 2% fatality rate, as the council inquiry points out.
And also, I think the issue of asymptomatic transmission, because the Casey also makes the point in the evidence that far from this being something that was discussed in evidence sort of in March, Whitty and Hancock were discussing it in mid-February, saying that there had been evidence from Germany.
That was even earlier. That was the tail end of January. But you're right. It was they knew by the middle of February that there was asymptomatic transmission. Yeah, and
I think if you zoom out from all of it, what we're learning about what was happening behind the scenes, we did see, with our noses pressed up against the glass, or even, sitting in those COVID press conferences that they had before the lockdowns. Neil, you can see it. You've got a Prime Minister on March the 1st go into a hospital shaking hands with people. Do you remember that one?
Well, he apologised for today.
He himself said, I probably shouldn't have done that. But, you've got evidence of pandemic spreading, and then there's mass festivals like the Cheltenham Festival being held in mid-March, which again the Prime Minister says, in retrospect, to try and hammer home to people that you should keep this, maybe we shouldn't have done that. But I think some of the decision-making that we saw before our eyes, all the actions, all the behaviours, spoke to the fact that it was like a train coming, and it kind of flattened everyone. And then they're kind of on the track, dizzied, going, oh, OK, now we need to act.
We have evidence of the Prime Minister in multiple states of mind. Let's be fair about it. At an incredibly critical point in the COVID response.
Yeah, and there was an interesting point in this whereby WhatsApp messages between Cummings and Kane are brought up, and this I think is about March the 15th. So they've now decided that they're going to have to do some sort of lockdown. And then the Prime Minister's having a conversation with the Chancellor who's warning about the bond markets, and Dom and Lee are messaging each other going, oh, the trolley, and swearing about him. And actually, I think he felt a bit touchy about that, like being pretty disparaging in their remarks, and sort of he's having a meltdown, he's having a Jaws moment, he's, basically oscillating again. And Johnson actually, challenged with exactly what you've just said by the KC, says, no, I had made up my mind, but when the Chancellor comes to talk to me about the economic implications of the public health decisions, it's my duty to listen to that. So the point I'm trying to make is that every time Johnson's presented with evidence, he still sticks to his testimony. He believes his truth, yeah? And that's what's coming across, that he will accept there were mistakes. He will apologise for the pain it's caused. He will accept that the government underestimated it in early Jan-Feb. But the actual criticisms directed at him, he tends to brush them off or push them away.
Beth, have a swig of your tea. We will pause there. When we come back in just a moment, we'll continue to examine that very, very crucial stage in March where decisions were being taken. Of course, the question, whether those decisions were taken quickly enough. Back in a sec. Welcome back. Still here with Beth Rigby as we examine Boris Johnson's evidence to the COVID inquiry. And just before we went into the break there, you were talking about that exchange between Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane, kind of, chief advisor, a guy looking after comms. And it was part of a sequence by Hugo Keith, the council inquiry, where he seemed to be suggesting, through evidence, that Boris Johnson still didn't think it was that big of a deal. But there was that very, very clear graph that was shown at the inquiry about capacity within the health service, that there was an inconsistency, that this was presented to Boris Johnson, one where there were no interventions, another where there were interventions. What did they discuss in the immediate aftermath of that? The comms, the communication strategy, rather than the practicalities of an overwhelmed health service. Yeah,
look, I remember working that night when this Sage paper dropped, and suddenly there was this sort of herd immunity strategy, and then you saw actually what the infection rates were looking like and what was going to happen to the NHS, and any which way it looked like it was going to be overwhelmed. And it was like a moment where, your heart dropped, like you can feel your intake of breath, your heart drops, and you suddenly realise the enormity of what we are all about to face. And Johnson's asked about this graph, and he says he's asked why at this point, when this graph is I've got it in front of me, Neil, there's like no measures, and there's this it's like Mount Everest, right? The peak is just enormous, and on base camp is the NHS being overwhelmed, and then the measures implemented, and it's a kind of more a Mount Kilimanjaro, like smaller, but it's still overwhelming the NHS, right? But what he's suggesting at the beginning is that, well, I just did what the scientists told me to do. But within that, there's an admission of like, well, if you're the Prime Minister and you're the leader, isn't it your job to ask these questions? Then he says of March the 15th, he was reconciled that he was going to have to suppress the virus. This couple of days after he's seen those charts, he said it's hard to get his head around it. He said, my state of mind was I'm now in virus fighting mode and we've got to sort this out. And then he's presented with this evidence going, well, that's not what your advisors were saying. What your advisors were suggesting was that on the one hand you were saying that, and then you go into another meeting and change your mind, and it was all a bit of a nightmare. Yeah,
isn't the implication of this period that Hugo Keith has, I think, set out pretty well, that Boris Johnson went through the gears pretty quickly, that there were measures that were introduced to bring down the reinfection rate, that they didn't even wait to see if they had the desired effect?
This is a critical question that the KC asks. First, he asks, if you'd acted sooner then Prime Minister, if you'd imposed measures on the 12th, 16th, 20th of March, might you have avoided a full lockdown? He says, I don't know, I defer to scientists. And then he asks really the critical question that everyone wants answered, or, this is the question that the inquiry is trying to answer. And actually, let's remember, this isn't just about a blame game. This isn't about a blame game. They're doing this inquiry so that next time this happens, because it probably will, that there's a different system in place so that basically we are as fighting fit as we can be as a country to deal with it. But the case he asked, the crucial question to me was, do you acknowledge you locked down too late in March? That's what you're getting to, Neil. Was the government not alert enough to this in January, February, early March? Were you blindsided by debates on herd immunity and lockdown fatigue? Did you not pay enough attention to the data? All of those, he's presented evidence suggesting that was what was happening. Yeah. Johnson's reply is that Sage lacked the data, and then there was this sudden appreciation that we were much further along the curve than we thought, i.e. this became his eureka moment. And I think the thing is that in his mind, genuinely, that's where the Prime Minister is. And there was definitely like this massive U-turn or about turn at this point.
I just wonder, and we asked a similar question when it came to Matt Hancock's appearance, whether Boris Johnson will be leaving the inquiry today thinking job well done.
What I would say is, from what I've seen so far, he's playing the best of a bad hand. And the reason I say this is that in terms of the tone, he's managed to not make it sound embittered. Mm-hmm. He's managed to not get into toe-to-toe tussles with people. But in terms of the substance of the evidence, it is reaffirming he didn't seem to grasp the nettle. And he's admitted the government didn't grasp the nettle. And I guess what he's trying to do is take up collective responsibility of blame. And then when you overlay all of the criticism around his conduct and leadership, or lack of leadership, prevarication and lack of attention to detail, you overlay that onto the substance of the evidence. That's why I think this is a very difficult wicket for him to defend. But I think that he has quite savvily played it as, yes, there were mistakes, but he somehow managed to not admit personal culpability.
What are you up to tomorrow, Beth? Fancy doing that again?
Well, I don't know, Neil. I mean, there's so many possibilities for me tomorrow. There's COVID. There's Rwanda. There's the Rwanda legislation. We could do a whole little side podcast on that.
How many sleeps till Christmas? Do you know what?
Honestly,
no,
Neil, can I just say, I'm just going to say this now. Can everyone just chill? It's Christmas. I've got presents to wrap. I've got cards to write. I've got actually, I've put out my trees. I've got all my children's things to do, and just Parliament is too busy, Neil.
Politics.
We've got
politics. It's terrible.
We've got Rishi Sunak next Monday at the inquiry. Now, in a way, and I'll lean. I mean, in a way as well. Isn't it more substantial for what an incumbent Prime Minister says than one that isn't there anymore, right?
Well, let's test that.
We're so
Monday.
Here back on Monday, aren't we? And I might be here tomorrow, Neil.
Never know.
It depends if the government's collapsing over Rwanda policy. Who knows?
Beth,
Who knows?
Always lovely to see you. Thanks
Happy
very much
Christmas.
for your time. And that is your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We will be back again tomorrow, most likely with more of the same.